Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, August 27th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, a report out today from We the Doers takes a closer look at what really slows federal employee accountability cases. Plus, we'll convene the latest data dish discussion and look beyond forecast to the data planners and responders need when a weather disaster threatens. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Army is moving ahead with a major effort to put nuclear microreactors on military bases, with about $2.2 billion going to 5 companies. The goal is to get at least one reactor to provide useful electricity to an Army installation by the end of September 2028. Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen joins me now with more information on the announcement. Rachel, thanks for being here.
Hello, Terry.
Let's start with the background question, though. Why does the Army want to put nuclear reactors on its bases?
So the basic issue is energy resilience, right? The Army says its bases have important missions that depend on reliable electricity. They want bases to continue being up and running, in case of an emergency. That emergency could look like, the commercial grid going down, liquid fuel supply chains being disrupted. So, the idea is microreactors would give them reliable power on site that can operate independently of the commercial grid.
And how did the Army decide which of their bases would participate in this effort?
So it says it's been about a year looking at installations, looking at things like their energy needs, their existing infrastructure, any kind of gaps in their resilience that they have right now. They also looked at environmental and technical factors. They also looked at things like seismic activity, right? You don't necessarily want reactors near fault lines. They announced their pairing of 5 bases with 5 contractors. So Antares Nuclear will work on Fort Bragg in North Carolina. BWXT Advanced Technologies will work on Fort Campbell in Kentucky. General Atomics Electromagnetic Systems will work on Fort Hood in Texas. Radiant Industries will work on Fort Benning in Georgia. And Westinghouse Government Services will work on Fort Drum in New York. So, these aren't necessarily the only locations that are going to get reactors. They expect more than 20 total nuclear microreactors will be built and operated across their installations, and they expect to pick other ones later.
How will these contractors then get up and running? How realistic is the timeline?
It's aggressive, but they're being pretty clear-eyed. They said, don't bet your firstborn on hitting milestones. But, there's an executive order that requires DoD to have an Army-regulated nuclear reactor operating by the end of September 2028. So that's their finish line for getting at least one going and providing, meaningful electricity, not just like, poking a button and saying like, hey, the lights turn on. Like it has to, they have to actually be getting something from it. But the ultimate goal is having reactors that are capable of operating for years, at high capacity. So today they said, there's a myth that the military doesn't have to follow environmental rules. That's not the case. They still have to follow things like the Clean Air Act, NEPA. So NEPA, they said, is going to move faster than it traditionally has. And that regulatory process is going to look a little bit different because it's going to be they're going to go through the Army's regulatory process as opposed to Department of Energy or the NRC. So they're working with those two organizations to try and align, their processes. And then that in turn should make it easier to go from Army approval to approval by other entities.
The technology around nuclear reactors has changed so much, but people who live and work around these bases may not be thrilled with the idea of having a nuclear reactor in their backyard. What does the Army and what does DoD have to do to engage the communities, and what do those folks need to know?
Yeah, they're going through the same environmental reviews that they do, every time they do a new bed down of, an aircraft or something like that. The Army says the projects will be self-contained, appropriately protected. They'll comply with regulations, designed to protect the dirt. When they dig down to install these, the soil, has to still meet all the requirements to not be radioactive. It recognizes that the communities have a vested interest in these projects, and it says it's going to be as transparent as possible, have town halls, things like that. So, they're not going to be Army operated. They're going to be prototypes that are contractor owned, contractor operated. So, the contractors themselves also have a stake in this.
Rachel, I know this was just the initial announcement, but did they talk about next steps? What will happen?
Yeah, so the overall goal is actually broader than bases. The Army is explicitly trying to use the program to create a commercial microreactor industry. So this is sort of the first step, mature the microreactors, meet these milestones along the way to September of 2028 and farther, and, advance it from demonstration to an actual deployment. So the vendors are going to get the funding as they hit their technical goals, and that's money from government as well as the private sector, private investment. They said each of these companies isn't going to necessarily be held to the same goals on the same timeline. Everybody's tech is a little bit different, but we'll see how it rolls out.
That's Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen. Thanks for this story.
Thank you.
You can find the full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, everyone agrees federal hiring and firing can take a long time. We'll look at what's actually causing the delay. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. When federal employee accountability cases drag on, attention usually turns to rules and protections. A new report looks at what happens inside the process itself, where delays are most likely to occur, and how they might be fixed. My guests are Maureen Clovers and April Harding, co-founders of We the Doers, a fiscally sponsored project of the Fund for Constitutional Government. April and Maureen, it is lovely to have you both with me today. Thank you so much for joining me.
We're glad to be here. Thank you.
April, I want to start with you and first just ask you to tell us a little bit about We the Doers. How did you come to be? What is your purpose?
We the Doers is a small nonprofit. We started in December of last year, but really the idea for We the Doers came when Maureen and I met for the first time in November of 2025 for a cup of coffee, because we had both commented in the Popbox Foundation's Departure Dialogues and provided extensive ideas for what we might do if we had the opportunity to make government better, more effective, and more efficient. And as we were chatting about our experiences as senior executives in federal government and our experiences during the change in administration and what we had sort of seen since then, we both realized that the perspective of the people doing the work at federal agencies who receive the OMB memos and the executive orders and the changes in law that affect the work really hadn't been a visible vocal part of the government reform conversation that was emerging. So we decided to sort of stop waiting for people to ask or wait for permission, and decided to start telling the stories of federal leaders and how changes affected their work and where things break down and why things don't work in government right now, so that we could get to the root causes of real sustainable solutions. So that is our mission, and our focus is to identify those root causes, develop comprehensive, sustainable solutions to them, and work with everyone else who's working in this space to move those ideas forward so that we can really build the government that the American people deserve. So that's how it started.
So, Maureen, we the doers is actually a sort of a dual meaning then. It's people who actually were doing the work of government, but also now people who want to do the work of reform. As you're thinking about this new reform agenda, how are you all actually doing your work?
Yeah, well, really, I think what sets us apart is a lot of the folks in the good government space have folks with more of an academic background or a lot of former Biden or Obama political appointees, some former Bush appointees, but they tend to be more Democratic. And that's great. And they have an important perspective. But they don't have the length of experience of a lot of senior executives and senior managers, and they haven't necessarily got it in the weeds, right? For a political appointee, success is getting money out the door for your administration's new priority, going to states, talking up the administration, right? But when you're a GS-15 manager or an SES, you really get in the weeds about why procurement takes so long, why it's so hard to hire and fire, why it's so hard to deliver IT systems on time. And you see that gap between the goal, the ideal, and reality. So we really wanted to engage people who'd been in the trenches, who understood, as April said, why things break down. So, for example, April and I met in November. We had our first workshop in December. We move fast. We want to show, too, that feds can move fast, or former feds. And we brought together 7 former SESs and GS-15 managers around the question, how do we make the government more effective and efficient? In essence, if DOGE had asked you, what would you have said, right? And we came up with a very candid, unvarnished look, and that's our first report. That's on our website. That came out January 20th to mark 1 year of DOGE. And we've continued that in our current report out today on fast but fair federal firing, where we brought together 10 managers with a combined 181 years of experience who collectively had tried to discipline or remove 22 employees. So we weren't just asking any federal managers. We were asking people who had really gone through this difficult process about what the process was, where it broke down, where it could be improved.
And let's pick up right there because today is that report release date. April, there's a lot of personnel issues you could have focused on. As you mentioned earlier, you both lived through the downsizing in 2025. Why did you decide to pick, as Maureen said, fast but fair federal firing?
There are 2 primary reasons that was the first thing we picked to focus on. One is because it's a really complicated, really thorny topic, and there's a lot of politics attached to that, and a lot of folks have to be very concerned about optics or existing relationships when they're talking about this. We are aggressively nonpartisan, and we also are new. And so we have less skin in the game and are able to tackle that and put forward a straw man, if nothing else, for the rest of the community to respond to. Although I think our report actually is quite detailed and the ideas that we have are very strong and thoughtful, it's still the first thing that we have seen so far that goes into detail, that talks about how it works now. And only we are in a position also to convene that group and talk about how things work now rather than at the abstract policy level. The other core reason is because all of the foundational changes to government that we identified in our first report and that we are focused on going forward, the root causes of culture issues and sort of constraints include making sure we have the right people in the jobs. And there are many parts of that, but you can't have a healthy workforce without the ability to remove people who are not in the right jobs. And so that's just an unfortunate reality of running any business or any organization, especially one with millions of employees. Sometimes removal is necessary. And if there is a bottleneck there and that can't happen, the ripple effect of not being able to do that is extraordinary, and it prevents the kind of culture change that's going to be necessary for the next version of government, whatever we rebuild from here.
Maureen, certainly the Trump administration coming in made no secret that it assumed federal workforce performance was a problem and it took too long to get rid of folks. So maybe there is at least agreement on the core problem, which is it does take too long to get rid of poor performers. But what did you learn while you were doing this work that maybe took you beyond conventional wisdom? Was there some big insight there about why?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to say we don't agree that most federal workers are not good workers. I mean, that was something that came up over and over again, that actually most federal workers are great workers and we want to support them. And we also want to recognize that morale for those workers really suffers when you have someone in the job who's not pulling their weight. So that's part of the reason we wanted to focus on it. The big insights. So we like to really get to the root causes of what the problem is. So we kind of just keep asking why. And this one kind of shook out. There were 5 root causes. The first one that I do think was pretty insightful is there is no one process. So we diagrammed the process. We probably went through 20 versions and it's on our YouTube channel. You can see it. It looks like a spaghetti monster. It's kind of choose your own adventure, like does your employee file a grievance? If so, go up here, that kind of thing. But what we learned is, the statutes governing removal for performance, that's 5 U.S.C. 4303, and for conduct, that's 5 U.S.C. 7513, are very, very short. I know you can't see me, I'm in the radio, I'm holding up my hand, but it's like a paragraph. And then OPM has a bit more, although if you go on their website, sometimes it looks like it's a 4-step process and, you're all done and you can remove the employee. But what we really learned is, okay, that's what's on paper at OPM and the regs. But then you go and your agency has their own regulations, or sometimes it's really just a culture thing about when you remove someone and how difficult it is. And then each bureau has its own culture within the agency. And then beyond that, if the first thing when you call HR and say, I've got an employee with a serious performance or conduct issue, they ask, well, are they covered by a collective bargaining agreement? And if so, which one? And there literally are, or at least were, thousands of collective bargaining agreements. So then you got to figure out what extra protections are in the CBA. And then beyond that, it's going to depend on, as a manager, which HR person and which lawyer you were assigned, and maybe which union rep also, accompanies the employee. And so there is no one process, and that's what makes it incredibly unfair, untransparent for both the employee and the manager, because you don't know what you're getting. So that's only root cause 1. Root cause 2 is that underperformers can game the system, and it's very easy to do so. So, we talked to one attorney. This is a post removal, but one attorney who said, she had a case that bounced back and forth between the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Office of Special Counsel for 10 years. And eventually they had to pay a settlement because the witnesses had died or retired or that kind of thing. But even before removal, what we found is there processes that were created for very legitimate purposes, but that are being gamed by underperformers. So in the 12 cases where we went super, super in depth with managers about exactly every step and how long it took, 10 out of 12, the employee filed an equal employment opportunity complaint with their EEO office. 7 out of 12, they filed a grievance. 6 out of 12, they filed a reasonable accommodation, and 3 out of 12, they filed Family Medical Leave Act. And for the EEO and the grievance, none of those were found to have merit, but it ate up a lot of time. So that's 2. I'll go much faster over 3, 4, and 5. 3 and 4 are basically 2 sides of the same coin, that managers aren't really incentivized to hold employees accountable. And in fact, their career can suffer a setback if, they're perceived as being unfair to employees, or there is an EEO complaint against them, that kind of thing. 4 is the culture in HR and OGC dealing with employment and labor relations tend to be very risk averse, and they're not incentivized to support the manager generally. It's a big generalization. And 5 is the managers don't feel like they have the tools and training to hold folks accountable. A particular pain point was writing airtight performance plans so you could say your employee was not minimally acceptable.
April Harding and Maureen Clovers are co-founders of We the Doers. April, let me come back to you. Maureen's just given us the 5 big findings here. When I put all of those together in my head, I come up with an institutional design problem. And interestingly, the ways to game the system, as Maureen described them, seem like they started as legitimate protections, right? We really want people to be protected from unequal treatment, or we want them to have due process. When you think about this from a design problem, is it a protection? Are the protections the problem? Is it the rules? How do you think about clearing out all of the underbrush so you can really get to reform here.
It absolutely is an institutional design problem, and that's the way we're thinking about it. We also think that the protections and the processes and the statutes that allow employees to do things like take medical leave or get a reasonable accommodation are super important. And in fact, in the same way that being able to effectively fire someone is actually really good for morale overall, because you don't have people sort of dragging on the productivity of the high performers, the people who are using these processes as loopholes, overusing the protections in the wrong way, creates a lot of noise that makes it harder for people who really are entitled to and need those things to get an effective resolution to their issue. So we believe strongly that those are important, and we want them to be more transparent and more efficient so that we can use them the way they are intended. So it's not necessarily the intent behind the rules, but clearing out the underbrush, as you said, is going to require some statutory and regulatory tweaking, because what has happened is the thing that happens almost every time that we as a society decide to try something. We have the best intentions, we outline it the way that we expect it to work, we create a policy, we create guidelines for how to implement that policy, and then humans do humaning, and we find out that it's not going to work exactly as we envisioned it. And so this is a moment where we can look back at how the policy differs from the theory and the practice differs from both the policy and the theory, and talk about addressing what has become loopholes in that policy and theory when it reaches the areas of practice. So some of that is just redesigning process. Maureen talked about how complex the process is. A large part of that is because there's not just one. So just as one example, making one single unified process that doesn't allow for the opaqueness that results from every individual agency and bureau and work unit having their own additional process is a way to retain the idea of the original policy, but do a pretty significant change to all of that complexity that has arisen from it.
Maureen, there are a lot of specific recommendations in the report, and they're all important. But one of the things that strikes me about reforming something like this is every stakeholder that you want to bring to the table has something they want to protect, something they maybe aren't willing to give up on because they represent that protection or they represent that authority. Let me ask you two questions. One, who needs to be around the table to actually get this to the point where it could be implemented? And where are the points of friction that you think, somebody's going to go to the mat for this? How are we going to deal with that?
Wow, that's a great question, Terry. I think it takes, first of all, more voices like ours saying, this isn't just an academic exercise. And it's apolitical. I think that's really important, right? That folks who were nonpartisan positions saw this on the ground, and these are the challenges. And, we kind of break our recommendations into those that need to be implemented by Congress, where we're looking at like an overhaul to those post-removal processes like the Merit Systems Protection Board. Really, Congress needs to take that up, right? And we've had some really good discussions in the Senate on that. And I think there's a lot of interest. So on the Senate side, it would be the HISCAC, the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. On the House side, it would be the House Oversight Committee. So I think Congress needs to lead. And that's also something that we're finding is, it was the first branch in the Constitution. It really should be the first branch, and it should reassert itself. And that will also avoid some of these wild partisan swings, like Trump, one, had an EO about this, and then Biden repealed it and had his own EO. And then the minute Trump 2 came in, they repealed the Biden EO. And so it makes it really hard to plan for the long term as a Fed. I think we need something on a much more bipartisan basis. So those are the key players in Congress. I do think the points of friction, obviously, I think most of the unions are very concerned about removing protections for federal workers. And understandably so. I mean, this is a sensitive moment, right? And they would say, well, we need more protections, not less. Look what happened with DOJ. But what I think we would say to that is, first of all, understood, right? I mean, I was DOJ'd myself. I was fired and rehired, and I took the DRP. So we're sensitive to that. But the fact is, with all these protections on the book, DOJ still happened. And part of the reason it happened is, well, first of all, they didn't worry about what was actually in the statute and all. But beyond that, I think public opinion gave them some cover, because it's very interesting. If you look at like the moment Doge was coming in, most Americans polled were in favor of Doge because they were in favor of the concept of efficiency and effectiveness. And Partnership for Public Service did a survey early in 2025 and found, 2/3 of Americans thought the government was corrupt and 61% thought the government was wasteful. So there was a general desire to fix things among the American public. But then you go a couple months into the future and NBC News and others are reporting, 60% of Americans disapprove of Doge. So people agree with the concept. They just don't agree with how it was implemented. And so I think, if unions and others just want to roll back the clock to 2024, they're misreading this moment and this opportunity for change.
And April?
I just want to add to that when we think about sort of what We the Doers brings to that conversation, we're talking about the entrenched interests and the different parties that have to resolve. A core part of our theory of change and how we're approaching this work is that the ground truth and the voices of people who are implementing the policy is critical to ground and contextualize those conversations. Because when you get into the nitty-gritty of negotiating how policy is going to roll out, it's very easy to forget that there's even a problem or what problem you're solving. I work in technology most of the time, and this is a constant refrain. We get into feature level details. We're talking about checkboxes and form fields. And sometimes it's helpful to pause and zoom out and say, what problem are we solving for the people who use this? The users of these policies are federal managers, and being able to consistently be the voice that returns to that idea makes sense, and here's how it falls apart in practice, and providing that ground truth in the conversation can continue to ground it in there is a problem here, which we can forget sometimes. And I think that's a really important part of how we hope to move this forward.
So let's stick with that for a minute, April. And when I look at the list of recommendations, and anytime you start on a reform effort, this might be the exception, but the normal rule is nobody gets everything they're asking for, right? So within your list, what would you hope would be the first reform that we would go after, and who would have to lead that conversation? April, you first, and then Maureen.
It's so hard to prioritize because really for this to work, all of the pieces of it have to work together. But I will say the foundation of reform has to be the process and the measurement. If we don't get that right, then the other things will be subsumed into the bureaucratic machine and will not sustain. So formalizing a single, consistent, transparent process so that everyone understands what is supposed to happen is going to be critical. And then measuring the activity so that we can have meaningful conversations about whether or not it's working. We propose some specific metrics, like how long it takes to fire someone and what happens when someone goes on a PIP. Those sorts of things have to be measured to have a meaningful, ongoing conversation about iterating on that.
And Maureen?
I think that's right. I do think I want to end on a positive note. I think one of our recommendations, though, is probably the most likely to have legs. And that's because I've heard a lot of discussions in the community. There seems to be broad agreement about consolidating the post-removal process, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for federal government employees, and the Office of Special Counsel. And some have even thrown in for federal employees the Federal Labor Relations Board. We don't include that in our report. But there's a lot of agreement around that. And I think the way that it could get done is in, legislation, but also the important thing to get unions and others on board is we need to reassert the independence of the Merit Systems Protection Board, or this successor agency that comes next. As everyone probably knows, after Trump versus Slaughter, which involved not the MSPB, but another independent agency. The Supreme Court decided that in most cases, independent agencies really report to the executive, and so he can change the appointees kind of at will or remove them at will. So we say that there needs to be a successor, but it needs to either be moved into the legislative or the judicial branch to make it truly independent. So I think that's a basis on which there could be a bipartisan deal.
April Harding and Maureen Clovers are co-founders of We the Doers. Thank you both for joining me today. Thanks for the effort that went into this report. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview and a link to their latest paper on federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, we'll convene the latest data dish discussion and look beyond weather forecasts to the data planners and responders need when a weather disaster threatens. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. For the latest Data Dish conversation, we're taking a look at the information that helps government respond to and recover from disasters. When a hurricane approaches, weather data is only the beginning. Joining me are Denise Ross and Christopher Markham of the Federation of American Scientists. Denise and Chris, I am so glad to have you both back for another Data Dish conversation.
It's a delight to be here.
Thanks so much, Terry.
Denise, let's start with you. We are entering peak hurricane season here, and on Saturday actually will be the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. So it's a good time to think about what's going on with weather data. And most people think about forecasts and weather models, but from a federal operations perspective, when we're talking about weather disasters, what kind of data becomes more important once a storm is approaching?
When a storm is approaching, and I know this from personal experience, having lived in New Orleans for many years, and including that Katrina time period, data accuracy is the most important thing. And there are two things that federal data really focus on. One is what's coming and who will be impacted. And I just want to give a couple of examples here. Some data that help us get more accurate forecasts. I just learned that the saltiness of the ocean gives insights into how quickly a storm will intensify. Who would have known? And the Argo fleet of floating buoys out of NOAA provides real-time information on water salinity. And why that matters is because that cone of uncertainty about hurricane landfall, timing, and strength, that knowing the saltiness of the water allows that model to be less uncertain. And that has an impact on real people because then officials and individuals can make better calls about whether to evacuate or shelter in place. And that's especially important for people with disabilities and the elderly, for example.
Weather buoys, who would have thought?
I know, who would have thought? Another example that's really important about knowing who's in the path of the hurricane. Right now, there's a lot of talk about changes to the census that might impact response rates, especially from people in mixed immigration households, for example, and also the demographic details of people living in a specific area. And emergency planners need to know how many people are in harm's way and what their characteristics are so they can get them to safety. For example, when I worked in local government at the city of New Orleans, we used data from the American Community Survey on households without access to a vehicle to determine how many evacuation buses we needed to get and what the ideal locations for pickup were. This makes sure that there's a seat on the bus for everyone who needs it. But if there's a significant undercount for any reason, there might not be enough seats.
Chris, Denise has just talked us through a couple of data sets that you might not think about when you're thinking about a hurricane inbound. What about some of the sets that will be essential as planners deal with the aftermath of a hurricane?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the data sets that we think about that's not quite one of those hurricane data that we typically think about that is really essential for both the planning and also the response further down the road are Medicare data. So we typically think about Medicare data as being about medical expenses, but they have an off-label use during hurricanes. One of the most at-risk populations during emergency response that we really need to plan for in advance are individuals with health conditions like emphysema, ALS, or kidney disease. And they really often, those individuals rely on at-home medical equipment that plugs into the wall. Ahead of a hurricane, planners can use the Health and Human Services Empower data to map projected power outages to zones, to outage zones, and to help pre-position mobile generators or staff or medical shelters that can send direct outreach to those vulnerable residents so that no one who happens to be relying on self-sustaining medical tech in their home gets left in the dark.
Denise, there's a lot of things to think about here. And, recalling that you were on the ground in Katrina, you've got that firsthand perspective. As agencies move from response to recovery, how do their data needs change? What information needs change over time?
Well, federal data are obviously relied on ahead of a storm to take actions to protect people and property. And then during the storm, the focus shifts more toward the local emergency operations center that's managing the response. And they're taking in lots and lots of local data at a rapid pace. And of course, they're still relying heavily on federal weather data. And they probably are also using data from different federal agencies like Department of Energy on the locations of critical infrastructure. And then as things shift to recovery, the feds start assessing the impact of the disaster so that they can deliver resources where it's needed. And we usually think of recovery in sort of short term and longer term. And during that short term period, damage assessments create a lot of data. In some cases, that comes from FEMA contractors walking the streets and documenting damage to buildings. There's a lot of intel about community needs that come from forms and applications, such as FEMA's individual and housing assistance programs that include demographic details like age, whether you own or rent your home, what your income level is, and whether you had flood insurance. And then for the longer term recovery, that's where it gets really interesting, because there you're trying to target federal funds in a way that will make people whole and build future resilience. And so an interesting collection of data sets comes into play at that point. 3 examples from 3 very different agencies include HUD, NOAA, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So HUD, one of the most creative data sets I've seen come out of that shop, is that they have something they call the U.S. Postal Service address vacancies data. It's an agreement that HUD has with the Postal Service to aggregate data on how different neighborhoods are recovering from a storm over time. They do this by measuring vacancies, but most importantly, housing units that are uninhabitable. The Postal Service gives them the title of no stat. And so that's a no stat house is one that cannot receive mail because it's just not, it's too blighted to live in. And so this data is useful in highlighting parts of town that need extra assistance in the recovery. And it helps local government and nonprofits target redevelopment grants and housing assistance programs where they're most needed. Another data set is from NOAA, and that's their sea level rise data. And that shows how specific properties might be impacted by rising waters. And so, for example, this would be used by the owner of a coastal business that flooded so that as they're rebuilding, they know how high they should elevate their new HVAC. So when the waters come, they don't have to replace the HVAC again. And then another example is the National Wetlands Inventory out of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's really essential because wetlands are the first line of defense against incoming water and storm surge. And these data are important for municipal planners and also Army Corps of Engineer projects to identify natural buffer zones that can absorb that storm surge. And it allows states to prioritize coastal restoration projects that can shield low-lying residential areas.
Denise Ross is the director of the Data Policy Institute at the Federation of American Scientists, and Dr. Chris Markham is a senior advisor for federal data policy, also at the Federation of American Scientists. Chris, let me turn to you. We've been talking up to this point about data that planners use to prepare for and respond to weather disasters, but Congress and the administration have both raised concerns about how long disaster assistance takes to reach survivors. How much of that is a data problem?
Yeah, one of the big challenges in disaster prep and response is knowing in advance who's at greatest risk of being left behind. Agencies really do need to do a better job at collecting and responsibly sharing disaggregated data for that purpose. And there was a 2021 Government Accountability Office report that emphasized how FEMA, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Small Business Administration need to work together more effectively to improve data quality and coordination for their disaster prep and response. And that challenge still remains today, even though it was a 2020 report. Most often, though, the data really do help shine a light on some of these problems, and an example on how the rest of us might sort of look at sort of accountability of disaster response planning and prep, and is through the usaspending.gov. USA Spending makes it really easy to see the gap between money the government promises and the money it actually delivers before, during, and after a disaster. Data allow you to track what's known as obligations, or that's the money that they promise, and the outlays, or the money they're actually spending, by agency, by the location, and by the program of delivery. And during Hurricane Maria, which affected Puerto Rico, FEMA, HUD, and DOE, Department of Energy, had obligated about $14 billion for recovery and modernization, which we know through USA Spending, but they'd only spent about $3.5 billion during that response. And so, in other words, like 3/4 or so of the promised funding hadn't actually reached people in need. And that information can be used to identify types of situations where there are bottlenecks in funding programs that Congress might want to respond to, or the administration can fill. And it can really help modify the design of programs to help getting that money flowing more efficiently.
And Denise, we've talked a lot here about the data that agencies use during disasters, but how resilient is the data ecosystem itself? I mean, what happens when a critical source of information isn't there when responders expect it to be? Maybe it's been taken out by the storm as well.
Well, normally in everyday situations, disruptions do happen to data that may lead to gaps in research or a less trustworthy statistic or inconveniences. But in a disaster, data disruptions like that can be life or death. And we have been monitoring the health of individual data collections at dataindex.us. And there is certainly a need for shoring up the resilience of the data ecosystem, from collections to sharing to privacy protections. And we do know that even before the disruptions of the last couple of years, the federal data ecosystem was not well equipped for the data needs for the rapid changes that happen during a disaster. For example, when a storm hits, officials need immediate infrastructure data to coordinate evacuations or locate critical assets. And the Department of Homeland Security has had a data set called Highfield Open. It's the Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data, not the best acronym in federal government, but it was a tool that brought together critical geospatial data from many sources. And I like to think of it as like a digital go bag for emergency managers at the local level. And it had information about locations of resources like hospitals and fire stations, hazards like nuclear facilities and concentrated animal feeding operations, if a storm hits them and disrupts them, then toxic stuff might get into the environment. And it also has information on vulnerable populations like people in nursing homes and where the childcare centers are. During emergency responses, local emergency operations centers relied on Highfield Open data, and especially those who have lower capacity, like they don't have maybe a full GIS team, for example. So they really depend on this digital go bag that DHS had collected. Fortunately, civic tech groups restored access to the tool and have created sort of a next version of it. So there is still a place that local governments can go. But my concern is that they may not be checking to see if it's there. They're just, like most of us, we take these federal data for granted. And then when you need them and they're not there, the stakes can be really high in a disaster.
And Kristen, looking ahead to the next major storm, even though FEMA has predicted a less volatile hurricane season, where is the biggest opportunity to improve disaster response through data?
Yeah, that's true. Although if we look over to the Pacific and at Hawaii, they've certainly had their fair share of run-ins with big storms this season. We live in a world that relies more heavily on the internet, on satellite, on cellular connectivity, and all of that connectivity is about sharing and access to data and information. So I do think that we need better technological preparedness for disaster response in a way that allows emergency managers to leverage all those resources, including a large tranche of private sector data, in responsible ways that can help with prep and response. For instance, data collected through the Gas Buddy app can be used and has been used to help reveal which gas stations are open and supplied during a disaster. And that is in contrast with how slower federal process might unfold with the Energy Administration calling gas stations to ask them if they're open. That Gas Buddy app, the private data, would help fill that gap in a more real-time technical capacity.
Denise Ross is the director of the Data Policy Institute at the Federation of American Scientists, and Chris Markham is a senior advisor for federal data policy, also at the Federation of American Scientists. Thank you both for this fascinating dig down into weather data and response data. Really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to another conversation next month on the Data Dish.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Trump administration is facing a new lawsuit after overhauls to federal employee suitability and performance standards. Four federal unions argue that the Office of Personnel Management exceeded statutory authority and violated the Civil Service Reform Act when it issued final regulations earlier this summer. Taken together, the unions say the changes will make it easier for OPM to fire employees. Here with the details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely.
For context, catch us up. What are the two final rules that are being challenged here?
This particular lawsuit is looking at one final rule. First up is a suitability regulation that was issued in June. And what this would do is allow agencies to apply suitability and fitness regulations, which are traditionally just for federal job applicants, and actually apply those to all current federal employees as well. And the change there would also expand the number of reasons that federal employees might not be found, quote, suitable for their jobs. So it seems to be just another way to kind of expand options for removing employees. So that's one of the final rules. The other one that's the lawsuit is challenging is on the performance management system, which OPM issued in July, and that final rule from them lifted a previous ban on a forced distribution system. So in other words, actually going to require agencies to cap how many federal employees can be considered high performers on a 5-point scale. It's gotten a lot of questions from federal unions, so now we're seeing sort of the culmination of their pushback against these rules.
When you look at the lawsuit, then, what is the core of its argument?
It argues that it violates, as you mentioned, the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, and then also the Administrative Procedure Act, and says that essentially OPM is taking on too much authority over federal employee firing rules, and that it will make it easier for OPM or agencies to remove federal employees from their jobs in a way that they believe is illegal. And it would also, they pointed to a separate final rule on suitability appeals, where employees now, after a final rule from OPM, now have to, if they believe that they were wrongfully removed due to a suitability reason, have to go to OPM rather than the Merit Systems Protection Board to challenge that decision by their agency, which the unions, again, in the lawsuit are arguing that essentially makes OPM the hirer, the firer, and the adjudicator of the federal workforce process, and that's essentially too much authority.
And has anyone from OPM come online to justify the rules or the system?
Definitely. We've heard a lot from OPM Director Scott Cooper, and there were also justifications, of course, in the final rules for their perspective on why these changes were needed. OPM Director Cooper said that, for example, with the suitability regulations, where now they apply to both job applicants and federal employees, he says that it just should make sense that both the applicants and the employees are held to the same standards. The pushback there is that there are already disciplinary regulations for federal employees separate from suitability, so you don't really necessarily need, at least from some of the critics' perspective, you don't need both of those things to be in play. And then OPM Director Cooper has also talked about repeatedly this idea that there's inflated ratings of federal employees on the performance management side, that too many are rated as 4 or 5 on the 5-point performance scale, and it's there's just too much of an imbalance to be, in their belief, an accurate portrayal of employee performance. So that is the sort of the argument in favor of changing that aspect of things as well.
But none of those get to what I think is the crux of the matter, which is OPM as the hirer, the firer, and the adjudicator. Any explanation from OPM there?
The way that they look at that, and I will just mention first, too, that it's not just suitability, but they're also changing that process for removals or any other disciplinary action during a reduction in force or RIF, and then also for probationary period removals. So in all three of those categories, OPM, again, is serving as the adjudicator rather than MSPB. What OPM officials have said is that it's meant to make the process more efficient and not meant to erode any independence. That, of course, has gotten a lot of pushback. For example, on the RIF appeals final rule from OPM, 99% of public comments were opposed to that change. So there's definitely been a clear pushback on the changes that OPM is making here and giving itself that authority.
Drew, are they making changes in other places to the suitability and performance standards that might be considered along with these with this lawsuit?
So it really is just a matter of looking at those three aspects of the process that we already kind of went over, where the OPM is acting as the hiring arm for the federal government, working on the firing side of things as well, and then the appeals for that. So I think that's really the crux of this new lawsuit from the unions, where they're concerned about OPM taking on too much authority and removing a merit-based process for federal employees, making the system unfair against them if they do, for example, appeal one of those decisions. So definitely something to watch, another lawsuit on the pile now, but definitely this is a big one here.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.